Thanks for joining us today at Weights and Wealth. And don't forget to apply today's lessons to live healthy and wealthy.
If this conversation will contribute to your fitness and financial gains, please share it with a friend or family member and give a 5-star review so more people can lift bigger weights and get bigger bank accounts. Welcome back to Weights and Wealth. This is going to be part 3 of our now 6-part series on education. If you missed part 1 and part 2, those are really good episodes. We'll recap them in a bit. Nick, do you remember the episode numbers? I think part 1 was 43.
Yeah.
Part 2 was late 50s, early 60s. We'll link it here if you're watching, but
100%. The shout out for today is I'm going to do 2. One is my little brother. You should probably listen to this. And
but your brother doesn't listen to the podcast?
I tell him to. I pay for his Spotify, so he really should. And then the wife, obviously, this goes out to Madison. Looking forward to your feedback, and thank you for putting up with this. It's I know you don't like when we have to be apart, but it'll be worth it, I promise.
All right, this week's Wealth Wisdom of the Week is to look into a 529 plan if you have kids. So this is sort of like a 401k for education. It's just like an education savings account. The deduction is only at the state level, and it varies from state to state. A lot of states don't have a limit of $10,000. So, if you contribute $10,000 to your kid's 529 plan, you can deduct that from your state tax, from your state taxable income. So in South Carolina, it'll save you 6.5%. And this also varies from state to state, but it can also be used for education, for high school education in South Carolina. And what I see a lot of people do is they'll, instead of paying the school directly from their bank account, they'll deposit it into the 529 plan and then immediately pay the school. So it's just an extra step.
Tax loophole there.
Yeah.
It's 100%
it's
worth
immediate,
it.
and it doesn't have to sit for any certain amount of time.
Yeah, I think you can also use it for technical schools, and then there are ways to reimburse yourself. I think it's taxed at a similar amount to a standard 401k. If you do withdraw early, let's say your kid doesn't decide to go to college, you can roll it over or do something else with it. If you don't end up using it, so it's not like that money is completely locked away forever.
Yeah, and there's something new that I think it's new in 23 that you can start rolling over a 529 into a Roth IRA if your kid decides not to go to school.
Oh, that's really cool.
The only thing there's a lot of limits on it. You can only do 35,000 total, and you're still stuck with the same limits each year. So you can only roll, I don't know what it is, $7,000 a year. And then that'll also take up your contribution for the year. So you can't do another $7,000.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. That's all good information. Talking about high school and stuff like that. Ted, if you want to quickly recap part 1 and 2 so we can lead into the alternatives, which we'll be focusing on today.
Yeah, sure. For part 1, we focused a lot on the early history of public education in America. So we started all the way back in the early 1800s and went through the literacy rates and how reading was taught, and then how public schools got started and some of the changes that were made. And Nick and I both read books by John Anthony Gatto to get a lot of information for those episodes. Then in episode 2, it picked up where the first one left off around the 1930s, 1940s, and went through the drastic decline in literacy over the course of the 20th century, and got into the ESEA, signed in 1965 by Lyndon Johnson, and then the No Child Left Behind, signed in 2002 by George Bush, and then eventually Common Core, 2013. But we went through kind of all those changes, just from a broader point of view in part 2. Talked a lot about the Derek Zoolander School for Kids That Can't Read.
To be honest, changes is a strong word because they really just doubled down on the same standards that kept failing.
Yes.
So it's classic Department of Education.
More money fixes all problems, right, Sean?
Yeah. Every time. We fix my problems.
So in part 3 here, we're going to just let people know about some alternative options to public schools. We'll do a separate episode. Part 4 will be on homeschooling specifically. So we're not really going to get into that one too much on this episode. But we'll quickly go over some other options aside from public schools. So one of the first options that I came across is I listened to a Jordan B. Peterson episode where he had a guy named Jeff Sandifer on. Jeff Sandifer was a professor at a school in Texas, and the curriculum was really binding him and forcing him to not be able to teach the stuff he wanted to teach. So he started his own MBA school, got it accredited, and it was wildly successful. And then he wanted to turn his sights towards primary education. So he started these schools. He started the first one called Acton Academy, and now I think there's about 160 of these Acton Academies across America. We did reach out to the one here in Charleston to see if we could get them in for an interview, but they said they were too busy.
Which is probably good.
Didn't have time for us. But the way that Acton Academy works is it's kind of like a Montessori school, but it's all student run. So starting from elementary school ages, the students really run everything and guide their own learning. And there's a teacher or a monitor in the classroom, but the kids have to work everything out. So it winds up being more of a Socratic method style of learning where they're figuring out how to do things, reading books on topics that interest them as a class. They figure out as a class how to do projects and everything, and how to kind of grade each other and keep each other accountable. And then they learn really quickly about like small scale systems of government for how they're like regulating each other. So it's really a cool experience. I think at least what he was saying about the Acton Academy. So if you want to learn more about the Acton Academy, head to Jordan B. Peterson's podcast and search for Jeff Sandifer. It was a really good episode. I really enjoyed it. And the kids still get grades in some aspect, in that like once or twice a year at these Acton Academies, they have these basically like presentations or science fairs for all the parents and just anyone in the community is asked to like come and watch the presentations and everything. So I feel like the kids are getting a lot more valuable experience in things that actually matter towards working in a job, whether it's public speaking, learning how to run a team, just teamwork in general. So
there's also, if you like that style of education, but you are like a religious individual or religious family, there's Chesterton Academy of the Holy Family. That's kind of a similar, from what I hadn't heard about Acton Academy, but it's a similar type school where they heavily utilize the Socratic method. They do have a more deliberate focus on like the old canon, like old Western canon, like the classics and stuff like that. So there is a little more guidance, like, hey, like this is the curriculum, but it is heavily student led. They are organized into like these political entities called houses, and kind of like Hogwarts, where like they have like contests, and like there's academic ones, athletic ones, arts oriented ones. Then they have this kind of interesting thing where they require the school to be under 200 students. So you're not allowed to go over that, so that it keeps everything very concentrated and like everybody, and it kind of builds this tighter knit community. But three of my siblings have gone to the one local to us in Illinois. I know that there's another one in Rockford, Illinois, and they're very successful. Very high level of learning, like, nothing that you're going to get in a public school. Like you're reading like Plato and Aristotle at 13 or 14 years old and like expected to come out with like college level stuff. So they have very good standards. Strenuous, they still teach Latin and stuff like that, which a lot of people don't talk about this, but when Latin was predominantly taught in the U.S., mathematics scores were far higher because people had like I don't know exactly what the correlation is, but I remember seeing a study that said like with the lack of teaching classical language, like math scores also were affected.
It's a very interesting correlation.
Yeah. So it's a very like interesting, like old school, like way of doing things. But I mean, throughout our education series, I think the trend has been very apparent that the old way of doing things produced higher quality individuals, and with this push towards ELA and math focused stuff, Common Core, ignoring like classical literature and arts and language and stuff like that, the whole person has suffered. So I think that's another interesting alternative if you're looking for like a more serious private school that focuses on that type of curriculum.
Yeah. And then one thing Ted mentioned about Acton Academy that's kind of interesting is that it's student led. And in John Gatto's book, Dumbing Down, he talks, so he has these 7 things that he teaches that aren't actual subjects. But one of those things is intellectual dependency. And so, your traditional school, like you have a teacher who's telling you exactly what to learn. And it kind of keeps kids from figuring out what to learn and then also how to learn it. Like they're taught exactly like the steps to learn something. And it's a valuable skill to be able to kind of create your own curriculum. I see this all the time with people like posting online about learning how to code. Nobody really knows how to come up with their own curriculum to like teach themselves how to code because they've been fed exactly how to learn something.
I mean, there are resources out there. Like Khan Academy has plenty of stuff. It's free. You can go on there and take basic courses in pretty much anything. I'll teach you how to do anything. So
I think some people might be worried about these alternative sources of education or weird student-led schools. Like, how are they going to get grades? How are they going to get into college? Because that's such a big focus for a lot of parents. But I know with the Acton Academy, and then there's another school. They're called Wonder Schools. There's not as many of them as the Acton Academies, but it's very similar. And what both of those Wonder Schools and Acton Academies do is they push the kids to get internships when they're in high school. And they don't secure the internships for them, and the parents aren't allowed to do it either. So it starts off with like, especially like Wonder Schools has these guidelines where the kid does like this step, this step, this step to secure a high level internship. And they've had a bunch of kids go to like SpaceX and like all these cool places. But what they do is first I think the kid has to find someone that works at the company, and they have to just like talk to them for a couple minutes or give them like a phone call. And at the end of the phone call, they have to ask, like, can I have your email so I can start emailing you? And then they start emailing, and then they ask, can I have a 5-minute interview? Like, I know I'm young, but I think an internship would be very valuable and I might be able to contribute. Like obviously internships are unpaid in high school, so it's basically free labor. And then after that 5-minute interview, they ask, so there's like this process where they slowly get their hooks in. But it leads to these very successful internships that these kids have, which like, I mean, if you put that on a college application that you had an internship at SpaceX in high school, like you think a college is going to say no. So aside from just the better education that a lot of these alternative schools are providing, there's also these other more well-rounded aspects outside of school that a lot of these schools push the students towards as well.
Yeah. I mean, that's 100% worth, like, and all these schools are accredited, like they're going to be like a legitimate high school diploma. Like you're going to get it. You're not going to have to go like apply for a GED.
It's not written in crayon.
Yeah. It's legitimate. It's just a very different way of doing things. And like we've said earlier, if you're doing the normal thing in America, you're probably not going to get where you want to be. So look for alternatives, look for something outside the mainstream, and generally it's going to be better than whatever standard fare is, whether it's exercise, diet, education, anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, with the college discussion, there's one of our future parts in this series is going to be specifically on college, but with the whole ELA and math push that we covered in episode or part 2, I feel like college is lumped in with that as well. Like everything became more about getting into college and SAT and ACT and spending time on that instead of on learning the test instead of actually learning valuable information. And if you go to the Vivek Ramaswamy podcast, he had Mike Rowe on in an episode a while ago. And they talked about how in the 70s, this push came down to the Department of Education to try to get everyone to go to college. So whereas before, like trades or other plans after college, military, trade school, whatever, were like well respected as a career path that you could take. In the 70s, they started saying college is the best thing that you can do after high school. And then really quickly that turned into like everyone should go to college. I know at our high schools, it was like expected that everyone went to college.
It was like a 99%.
Yeah, exactly. Even if it wasn't the best option for most kids, everyone got pushed to college. And then you have the kids that figure out it's not for them and eventually choose another path. And then after that, it was free college for everyone. And the government got involved in student loans. And now whenever the government gets involved in any industry, the price inflation is hundreds of percents. And now college is so unaffordable because they tried to make it free.
Yeah. And I mean, like again, this comes from a place of good intentions because, at that point, college grads were far out earning people who didn't have a college degree.
Yep.
But this is likely because that people who were going to college at that time were more adept, I would say, or had like a natural inclination for higher learn, or no, that's a bad way to put it, but that they're they're in like the top 15% of
maybe there's
people
more
in
studious students
yeah, so that could have been why they're earning more, and whereas now it's really starting to even out.
Well, I mean, you flood the market with anything, the value is going to go down. The quality is going to go down.
Yeah, we'll get in the college episode, we'll get into all the statistics of how many people think college is valuable now and everything, and average wage earner with a college degree and everything. But I thought that was like a good point that Mike Rowe had that really went along with the whole standardized test score, ELA and math push that we covered in part 2. It's like the same thing, just pushing these standardized tests and throwing learning by the wayside. But I feel like these alternative schools don't do that as much because public schools are just worried about the stats for the state for their funding. But these alternative schools don't really get state funding. And some of these schools, when you look into the prices, it would be very hard for most families to send their kids to, like, we went to public school. We didn't have an option, right? Or like my family I'm talking about. But then we can get into a conversation, well, should people just get a credit and be allowed to use that credit to go to any school? Or does your tax dollars just go to public school? Like it's strange that if a parent in the inner city wants their child to go to a much better school in the suburbs, like it's by zip code and you have to go to this school, even though the school is terrible. Right.
It doesn't make sense.
Like, why can't we have credits that you use for education and they're
or just stop taxing people for their property that they own and let them use that money to go to school. How about if you buy a piece of land or a house, you own it outright once you pay off the mortgage? That sounds nice, doesn't it?
Well, and the average, like in some states, the average dollar amount spent on a student per year is around $25,000 to $30,000. And that vastly outweighs the cost of some of these alternative schools like Acton or Wonder School.
Mm-hmm.
But you can't use that money that your taxes are getting pulled towards to go to one of these schools. Another alternative option is charter schools. I've got some statistics that we found on charter schools here. From 2009 to 2018, It went from 3% of public school students were at charter schools to 7%. So it's been increasing. And if you don't know what charter schools are, they're public schools. They're publicly funded, but they're given a charter to operate on their own outside of state and federal guidelines, so they can create their own curriculum, but they're still publicly funded through the normal means. But there's a U.S. Department of Education study also that found that there was really no difference in test scores when the charter school students were given these tests. No difference in test scores from public to charter schools. Mm-hmm. So I think it probably depends on the charter school how different it is from actual public education.
Yeah, I mean, well, perhaps the charter schools are like also go outside the purview of just teaching towards the standardized test, because I think that was based on their, math and ELA test scores.
Yeah, that's true. If they're getting the same test score, but the charter school kids aren't doing any prep for the test, they just go in and take it one
other
day.
Things as well.
Yeah, then they're probably going to...
That wouldn't show up in the data.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. How to Live Statistics. Good book. I think that's also part of... There's do charter schools have like a exam to get in, or is it just kind of
a lot of times
admission?
It's a lottery? I found when I was doing the research for it, because I didn't know much about charter schools before we were prepping for this episode. But yeah, a lot of times the testing I think is going to be more for private schools, whereas the charter schools is going to be more of a lottery a lot of times.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that any type of place where you can put your kid or yourself, if you're 12 years old and listening to this podcast, the more
deciding your own future.
The more selective you can be with where you are, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah.
I would argue that any type of selection criteria for where you're going to be will inevitably surround you with higher quality individuals. And the saying is you're the average of your 5 closest friends. Surround yourself with higher quality individuals, you will become a higher quality individual. And I think that pays dividends for parents, having their kids with high academic, athletic performers. They're going to get pushed and learn and grow more quickly, efficiently, and in a better manner. And the way I look at it, I would always rather be like a normal fish in a pond than in a small pond than the biggest fish in a tiny pond. I would rather be in a place where I know I'm a high performer, but I'm surrounded by high performers, and so it's forcing me to grow. So I can't become complacent, and I can't, just kind of rest on my laurels. So
that's why you went from UD to Notre Dame.
It is. I'm serious. I mean, I was not challenged at UD at all. I was going out 4 days a week, spend 2 hours in the gym every single day. I was running 3 different clubs, and I still had a 3.9.
Yeah.
It was not a challenging college. High school, sophomore year of high school was more difficult than freshman year at UD.
Yeah.
And so I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm wasting my time. And so I went to Notre Dame and I got hit by a truck. It is a complete, that difference exists at all levels of education.
Yeah, definitely.
High school, elementary school, particularly college, the more prestigious and selective the institution you can be a part of, the more you will grow, the more you will be challenged. And that's not only from the curriculum, but from your peers. And then once you get out, I know for a fact that unless you are the valedictorian from, college of middle of nowhere, and then you're going up against a guy that graduated from Harvard or from Notre Dame or from Duke, all these prestigious universities, that guy is far more likely to get picked.
Well, a lot of people might view Harvard on your resume as a bad thing now.
Sometimes, yes. but you know what I mean. It's it's that name recognition. If you're going to be paying for college, or if you're going for free, you might as well go to the most challenging, prestigious place and get that name brand recognition.
Yeah. I think that goes back to the primary education level as well, right? you want to, I think as a parent, make sure that your kids are challenged so that they don't stagnate, like word for word, basically what you said. So I think if you have the means to influence your kids' education, which everyone does in some way, right? If you can't pay for them to go to a different school, if the public school around you is terrible, well, you can at least check in on what they're learning, right? And make sure that they're not learning crazy things like a lot of public schools are teaching. I mean, my dad would always like ask us what we were learning in our history classes, and then he would discuss like political things with us. So we would have these discussions and we would see different sides of different arguments around history and politics. And I think it made us very like well-rounded in terms of being open to new ideas, because we weren't only being fed one side.
Yeah. It's very important not to have like a hands-off aspect to your child's education.
Yeah.
Like the idea of like handing your child off to a complete stranger and letting them influence the most formative years of their life is a very, very foreign concept. And it's only been around about 100 years.
Yeah.
Prior to this, everything was, private tutors, or like, you're at a very particular institution where a person by name, what they're teaching, everything that's going on, in a very agreed upon way. But if you're someone that is at odds with the current culture in any type of way, like you're essentially just sending your kid off to a brainwashing factory, and you need to have at least a pulse on what's going on and challenge what is coming out of there.
Yeah. And you touched on something that goes back to part one. So if you missed part one, be sure to go back and check that out, because we went through the timeline of the development of education, public schools in America, public education. And yeah, like what you were saying is about like 160 years ago that public schools were started in some of the bigger cities, up in Boston, really, like in Pennsylvania, where they first started, New York City. And then it wasn't until the early 1900s that it became a thing where like everyone started going to these schools. But I mean, before that, if you look, a lot of Americans were extremely well read, extremely well educated. If you look at the founding fathers, some of those guys were like 18 years old and they were brilliant and had read hundreds of books on government and law and everything at like 18 to 20 years old. People don't realize a lot of the founding fathers were between 18 and 30 years old. They weren't these old 60-year-old guys that were drafting the Constitution. Some of them were, but a lot of those guys were super young. So it's not like everyone back before the public education system started were just these like dumb peasants. That wasn't the case.
I would argue that probably the average intellectual level of the educated person, like let's say you take someone that is quote unquote educated today and then someone that was quote unquote educated in the 17th century, I would say that person in the 17th century was probably more like if they had the same access to information, would probably be more intelligent, more well-read, more well-rounded.
Yeah.
In many different aspects.
Yeah, and I mean you can see that statistically, aside from just the literacy rate, as we covered in part one, some of the best-selling books, that the amount of copies that were sold of some of these books that kids in middle school today can't read, it's above their reading level. It was like every household had one based off the number of copies that were sold. So, yeah, but if you missed part one and part two, go check those out. And we'll link them below in the show notes. And do you guys have anything else to add to part three here?
No, I think we just about covered all of it. So be sure to tune in to 1, 2, and 3. And looking forward to discussing 4, 5, and 6.
Yeah, next we'll do homeschooling, college, and then finally at the end we'll do the current things that have recently been added to public education curriculum.
Yeah, sounds good. See you next week.
This is Weights and Wealth, your one-stop shop for entertaining education on building a stronger body and bank account.
We are not doctors or financial advisors and must warn you this is not medical or investing advice. It is for your entertainment.